That is one hormone. So we'll look at another hormone that is actually involved in the thyroid gland. This is called parathyroid hormone. And this is secreted from the parathyroid glands, which are these 4 smaller glands that are embedded in the thyroid gland itself, hence the term parathyroid. So if we look at the posterior surface of the thyroid glands, this is a posterior view or a dorsal view. We can see that these 4 smaller glands are kind of stuffed into the thyroid gland, and they are involved in releasing another endocrine hormone that's called parathyroid hormone. And this is involved in regulating blood calcium levels, and it's going to be the antagonistic hormone of calcitonin. So I talked about calcitonin, which is released from another cell in the thyroid gland. We didn't talk about that cell too much in detail, but basically calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are kind of antagonistic hormones. Calcitonin is going to decrease blood calcium levels, and parathyroid hormone is going to increase blood calcium levels. And together, those 2 hormones help to regulate our levels of calcium in the blood, okay? And we won't say much more about parathyroid gland or parathyroid hormone other than that, okay? Let's move on to objective 5. So this is to describe the effects of glucocorticoids on the whole body metabolism, and then compare physiologic effects of glucocorticoids to their pharmacological effects. So another important endocrine gland is the adrenal gland. We talked a little bit about the adrenals in our previous unit in the autonomic nervous system, and we talked about the medulla of the adrenal gland. So this central portion of the adrenal gland, which we identified as being the medulla, and this is where we had those chromaffin cells, which are involved in the sympathetic activity. But we've also got this cortical region or this cortex region of the adrenal, which is involved in hormone production. This is where we have adrenal corticoids being produced, and they're involved in some of our endocrine function. They're also involved in the hypothalamus adrenal axis as well. So here we have 3 hormones being released. One is the mineralocorticoid. It's called aldosterone. That is involved in sodium and potassium regulation. It's going to be active in the kidneys in helping to balance out our sodium and potassium reabsorption in the kidneys. The second hormone is glucocorticoid. I can never say these words. Glucocorticoids. An example of this is cortisol. And cortisol is a really common hormone. It's sometimes called a stress hormone, and it's involved in regulating the body's response to stress. It's also involved in regulating our metabolism. Okay, so anytime we have stress being endured by the body, and when I say stress, I don't necessarily mean everyday stress, like stressful events, but actual physiologic stress. So things like weight loss can be a stressor, surgery can be a stressor, pregnancy can be a stressor, and then actual stressful events can actually be physiological stressors to the body as well. But these types of stress stimulate or trigger cortisol hormone and help our body to actually manage and regulate this stress. And then the third hormone secreted by the adrenal cortex is sex hormones or androgens, and these help with the regulation of the reproductive function. They're going to be involved in things like testosterone and estrogen production in males and females respectively. So they're more involved in the production of our sex hormones and in the reproductive function. So these are the 3 hormones that are secreted by the cortex of the adrenal gland, and these are stimulated or released on the influence of the anterior pituitary, which secretes ACTH. We'll talk about ACTH, and is a part of that axis where the hypothalamus secretes CRH, the pituitary secretes ACTH, and that ACTH stimulates these 3 hormones from being released from the cortex. And I'll talk more about the other tropic hormones that are involved in that axis when we do a drawing a little bit later on. All right, and then just to speak about the medulla here briefly, again, we know it's involved in chromaffin cells and the epinephrine and norepinephrine release, which is basically involving the sympathetic branch of the autonomic division. And then it's going to be under neural control, meaning that neurons are involved here. And this we should already know, right? Those preganglionic sympathetic neurons synapse onto the medulla, and that influences the release of these three hormones. Okay. All right, let's speak here about glucocorticoids and their action. So glucocorticoids, such as cortisol, I mentioned earlier, are involved in regulating the stress response. So we can think about this as being the hormone of stress. And it's regulated through that CRH-ACTH axis. So CRH comes from the hypothalamus, ACTH comes from the anterior pituitary, and these are the two tropic hormones of this axis that stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete those end hormones, those tertiary hormones that I talked about earlier. Now, the general function here is that we're going to mobilize energy stores, which we need during a time of stress. If you think about physiologic stress, we need to mobilize energy stores in order to adequately handle some of that physiologic stress. It's also going to help suppress the immune response. So it's going to suppress the inflammatory or immune response that may otherwise be experienced during a time of physiologic stress. And a really important example of this is surgery. So during surgery, our body tends to want to have this really drastic immune response. We're going to flood the system with white blood cells and other immune cells. And sometimes when we're having normal surgery, we don't want that drastic immune response. And so the body stimulates cortisol, but we can also exogenously administer cortisol as a way to kind of dampen or tone down that immune response and prevent injury or pathology that may be brought about as a response, as an effect rather of some of this drastic immune response, okay? And so this is sometimes how the immune system can work for us, but also against us. And we're actually also seeing that now with this coronavirus, right? The coronavirus is actually stimulating this really large amplified immune response in our lungs. And that immune response is what is bringing about a lot of the pathology, the pneumonia that we're seeing associated with the virus itself, right? It's the immune response of our body that is being detrimental. Okay, and so we can administer cortisol as a way to dampen or regulate that response. Okay. So here are some of the actual functions of cortisol during stress. It's going to increase cortisol secretion. We're going to increase the sympathetic activity, which is our fight or flight or freeze response, which is ideal for this type of physiologic stress. Increase epinephrine secretion, increase ADH or vasopressin secretion from the posterior pituitary, as well as angiotensin II. These two functions, both ADH and angiotensin II, are going to help preserve our blood volume, which is another important thing that we want to do during physiologic stress. And then bring about a fight or flight kind of mode, which helps us to mobilize energy stores to produce energy and then maintain our blood pressure, also maintaining our blood volume, which, as I mentioned earlier, is really brought about by these two hormones, ADH and angiotensin II, which help to stabilize our blood pressure and blood volume. Okay. All right, so this is how cortisol is involved in mediating a stress response.